Looking up from the reef, the water is inviting. If you've recently been discharged after burr-hole surgery for a subdural hematoma, you likely feel recovered and ready to get back under the surface. Most divers assume that once the surgical incisions have closed and the intracranial air is absorbed, the body is ready to handle the pressure changes of a standard dive. However, the physical holes in the skull are rarely the factor that prevents a return to the sport. This matrix clarifies the distinction. On the left is the physical assumption, a skull that has structurally healed. On the right is the neurological reality, the recovery of the brain tissue and its electrical signals. Treating your return as a surgical healing timeline creates a false sense of security. Your safety depends on how your brain tissue has recovered from the underlying injury. The primary concern following a subdural hematoma is an increased risk of epilepsy and sudden seizures. While a seizure on land is a medical emergency, a seizure underwater is almost universally fatal. Without immediate specialized rescue, the environment makes survival unlikely. Because of these stakes, medical clearance focuses on your baseline population risk. This is the standard low likelihood of a seizure occurring in the general public. To return to diving, you must hit specific clinical milestones that prove your individual risk has dropped back down to that baseline. This requires a rigorous, multi-year vetting process. It is a significant trade-off, but it's the only reliable way to prevent a fatal event at depth. The pathway back to the water begins once you achieve complete physical recovery. The first hurdle is stabilization. If you require ongoing anticonvulsant medications, your brain hasn't organically stabilized, which is a strict contraindication to diving. Second, you must have zero neurological deficits. Your balance, judgment, memory, and vision must be perfectly intact. Finally, follow-up CT or MRI imaging must demonstrate a satisfactory resolution of the hematoma with no lingering pressure issues. Passing these baseline requirements is only the first step. It allows you to begin the mandatory waiting period required to prove long-term electrical stability. Your seizure history determines your timeline. Doctors categorize these events as either early or late. Early seizures occur within the first 7 days following the bleed or the surgery. While these are relatively common in large hematomas, an early seizure statistically increases the risk of developing epilepsy later in life. Late seizures are those occurring more than 7 days after the initial event. If you experience a late seizure, the risk of future events remains elevated above the population average and drops very slowly over time. Any seizure after surgery indicates neurological instability. This typically results in a significantly extended suspension from the sport, or even a permanent one. If no seizures have occurred, the most critical factor in your return is the original cause of the subdural hematoma. On this graph, the acute traumatic pathway represents injuries caused by violent head trauma. This line starts high on the risk scale due to brain contusions. Because of structural damage, seizure risk remains persistently high for years, even if you feel fine. For divers in the acute category, the trade-off often involves a multi-year waiting period or permanent retirement from diving. The chronic pathway is different. These bleeds develop slowly from minor trauma or occur spontaneously. This line starts much lower and drops more quickly. For a chronic bleed with full recovery, the risk falls back to the general population average within 1 to 2 years. Your specific mechanism of injury dictates your future in the water. An acute injury and a chronic bleed follow entirely different medical trajectories. Diving medical referees evaluate each case based on statistical probability models. To grant clearance, they require evidence that your risk of a future seizure is well below 1% per year. Plotted on a quadrant chart, the top right represents a chronic hematoma with no seizures, showing a high probability of returning. Conversely, the bottom right shows an acute traumatic injury, where return probability remains low because seizure risk stays elevated. Clearance is never a matter of just waiting out a calendar date. It is a calculation of your future neurological stability. For the chronic or spontaneous diver, the path back to the water is often viable. The trade-off is time. You must strictly observe the 1 to 2 year non-diving period to allow your brain to prove its stability. For the acute traumatic diver, the reality is more difficult. The associated brain injury often means your seizure risk stays high indefinitely. In this case, the necessary trade-off is prioritizing your life over the sport and accepting that diving is likely permanently unsafe. The final step for all categories is a formal assessment by an approved diving medicine physician, who will review your surgeon's reports and your follow-up imaging. While burr-holes address the immediate surgical need, only time and a specialized medical referee can determine if you are truly ready to return to the depths.